Hello, I'm John Holmes, Professor of Medical Informatics and Epidemiology and Associate Director of the Institute for Biomedical Informatics. I'd like to tell you about PennTURBO, a novel tool for standardizing clinical data. Large healthcare systems generate enormous amounts of data which come from a variety of sources, such as the electronic health record, laboratories, the radiology department, and pharmacy. These data come from specialized systems, each adhering to its own specification, so that there is considerable information system heterogeneity. This is manifest in the representation of data, or their syntax, and in the representation of the knowledge by those data, or their semantics. Unfortunately, we can't enforce homogeneity at the system level, so we need to create it once the data are produced by these varied systems. This leads us to the second problem, which is that without this homogeneity, the identification of patient cohorts for research or clinical care is challenging. So we have created PennTURBO Semantic Engine, which stands for Transforming and Unifying Research with Biomedical Ontologies. So what does it do? Well, first, it transforms relational data to graphs, and I'll explain those in the slides coming up. And this gives us flexibility for engineering our queries. It unifies data from different sources through alignment to reality. It supports research by tracking the provenance of data processing and integration. And it supports biomedical ontologies to provide computable hierarchies and connections that are recognized throughout the industry. Thus, PennTURBO can find semantically rich cohorts across Penn Medicine data resources based on such things as demographics, for example, sex or body mass index, diagnosis related to a disease class, such as lung cancer, medications that have been prescribed, such as opioid orders, lab test results, such as blood glucose measurements, representation in specific resources, for example, the Penn Medicine Biobank or a Penn Cancer Registry. So here are some features of PennTURBO. It transforms relational EHR data into a semantic graph, which is much more versatile than a table-based schema. Turbo unifies data from heterogeneous sources and uses a semantically rich representation that positions data in reality not as an abstraction. It gracefully addresses missing or conflicting data so that the ground truth that humans have biological sex holds, even when the data about a patient's sex are missing. And it draws intelligent conclusions based on knowledge embedded in ontologies and rules guided by domain experts. So here's a little more detail on the semantic richness I've mentioned. We want to use a graph to find patients with lung cancer and lung cancer subtypes. This architecture extends easily to patients prescribed a class of drugs or having particular procedures. So here is our graph. On the graph, note that concepts such as patient or lung cancer are represented as nodes, and the relationships between those concepts are represented as lines with arrows or links that denote the direction of these relationships. Furthermore, the color of the links represent the semantics of the relationships. Thus, you can read this graph as a series of semantically rich statements, such as A is a patient, and A has breast cancer, which is a cancer, which is a disease. Such a representation can be easily queried to identify a patient cohort from any location in the graph. And finally, the graph can be enriched with new nodes and relationships at any time. So just to review the advantages of this representation. Semantics are represented and preserved. Intuitive knowledge representation is provided by the graph. Queries can be run in any direction or neighborhood on the graph. It's scalable. Nodes can be added or updated as needed, and sometimes this is a difficult thing to do in a traditional relational schema. So let's talk a little bit about the connections with other resources that are available through Penn. Data are read from the Penn data sources that you see here, Penn Genomics and Phenomics data, the Penn Medicine Biobank, Clarity, Caboodle, Data Lake, and others. So PennTURBO uses something called Carnival. to aggregate, clean, and export data that can then be aligned to OBO Foundry ontologies, which are an industry standard. Carnival is a graph database for linking different data elements in a graph. It aggregates and semantically enriches or encodes the meaning of data from disparate sources into a unified property graph resource and provides tools to reason over and interact with that resource. It's inspired by the Open Biological and Biomedical Ontology, or OBO Foundry ontologies. And the Carnival clinical extension of the Carnival data model supports the execution of common investigatory tasks, including harmonizing complex patient, specimen, and healthcare information, patient cohort identification, case control matching, and the production of data sets for scientific analysis. Next, Carnival exports data through an application programming interface to the Turbo Knowledge Graph. The Knowledge Graph contains connected knowledge about diseases, meds, labs, and assays. Then Carnival transforms that instance data to be OBO compliant and then exports to cohort graphs, which can then be accessed for future use. Carnival also extends and connects to Penn AI, which is described in detail on another presentation in this series. And finally, PennTURBO supports a cohort explorer that supports end-user search of aggregate data in a web-based platform. So what are these OBO Foundry ontologies that we use for interoperability? Well, there are over 100 ontologies available to us to cover various biological and clinical domains. The ontology for biomedical investigations is an integrated ontology for the description of life science and clinical investigations. The Mondo disease ontology aims to harmonize disease definitions across the world. The chemical entities of biological interest ontology is a structured classification of molecular entities of biological interest, focusing on small chemical compounds. The gene ontology is an ontology for describing the function of genes and gene products. And finally, the relations ontology is a collection of relations intended primarily for standardization across all of the ontologies in the OBO Foundry. So accessing Turbo, it's important to keep in mind that PennTURBO runs in the background. This is not an application that you actually see or can actually use directly. Queries of the Penn data resources are submitted first through the Penn Medicine Data Analytics Center, otherwise known as the DAC, and personnel in the DAC will assist you with creating and running queries that leverage PennTURBO. You will need for activities preparatory to research to inform the Penn IRB of your activities, when ordinarily no formal protocol is needed. However, for research projects, you will need to prepare and submit an IRB protocol and contact the PennTURBO team for access to the Phenotype storefront or the Penn Medicine Data Analytics Center. And you also need to provide access to a secure server for holding data sets resulting from your queries. So the nice thing about PennTURBO is it's open source. We are developing PennTURBO as a generalizable open source project using GitHub. And these components include Carnival, the semantic engine, and knowledge graphs for rapid queries. As of right now, we have knowledge graphs for drugs, ICD codes and disease terms, and we are working on the lab test knowledge graph. Additional information on the ontologies is available at obofoundry.org. So we have a use case to present to show actually that PennTURBO works. So in this case, over to the right here, you see that the Carnival can pull demographic data for patients with samples in the Penn biobank. Note that these data are very heterogeneous in the biobank, and EHR data are in completely different formats. Second, there is a loss of gene function mutation data set available in a comma delimited format, which is also accessed by Carnival. The data are then stored in GraphDB, that you see here is the RDF triple store, where the data are enriched by the semantic engine using a transformation instruction set, which provides the specification for storage in GraphDB. The semantic engine interacts with GraphDB, and the biobank transformation instruction set. This instruction set ensures that the data coming from heterogeneous data sources can be processed and represented identically in GraphDB. So I'd like to acknowledge the authors of this paper that was published in the Journal of Biomedical Informatics. It was a proof of concept paper. It was written by Hayden Friedman, along with co-authors Heather Williams, Mark Miller, David Burtwell, Danielle Mowry, and Chris Stockert. So our plans for the future, first of all, are our phenotype storefront, which is a one-stop resource for building clinical phenotypes for clinical research at your desktop. It includes a cohort explorer, the capacity for performing guided queries, and also visualization tools so that you can see the results in a meaningful format. We also are aiming to support additional lab types or data types, as I mentioned before, with lab tests, specialties and roles of practitioners, generation of output for common data models, integrations with OBO-based linked data at other institutions, and other additional data types as they arise. So I'd like to acknowledge the PennTURBO development team led by Chris Stockert and assisted by Mark Miller, who is a biomedical ontologist, Danielle Mowry, Chief Research Information Officer at Penn Medicine, and Heather Williams, a Senior Data Scientist. Our funding was provided by the Institute for Biomedical Informatics, by the Institute for Translational Medicine and Therapeutics, and the University of Pennsylvania Health System. And if you have any questions about PennTURBO, please don't hesitate to contact Danielle Mowry or Heather Williams at their respective email addresses. Thank you very much for your attention.